If you want a book that not only has a satisfying ending, but has scenes that by the time you've finished reading the scene, you just want to punch the air because you're so satisfied with just how that scene made you feel, then this video is for you. Now, because of just the way I operate, I usually work by going out and seeing what everybody has talked about a certain subject, and then I kind of take everything that everybody has said and distill it down into manageable frameworks that authors can use. That's what I did when I created the 40 chapter plot module. That's what I do with a lot of the work that I do on this channel. But this is actually something a little bit different. This is a pacing technique that I specifically created after just observing what a lot of authors and creators and filmmakers, etc., are doing. And I call it the drop. And it's a pacing tool that will make basically any story that you develop and any crucial climactic moment in a scene just, beautifully satisfying for the reader to consume. Plus, this should hopefully create a better understanding of what pacing is for you, because pacing is one of those things that people talk about, and it can be a little confusing about what people mean when they talk about pacing. While it's only going to cover a small sliver of what pacing is, this should hopefully give you a better understanding of how it works. But just to give you a rundown of what pacing is, and I could do a whole masterclass on this, but the fundamentals of pacing is that it is the illusion of how fast or slow your scene is. And I specify that it is an illusion of progress in your story, because you could easily write any book in one sentence, right? Think of the Lord of the Rings. What's a one sentence way of just finishing the Lord of the Rings early? And the Eagles threw them into Mordor and they dropped the ring in Mount Doom. Boom. And you're done with the whole story. But of course, that isn't satisfying, right? We have to create an illusion of buildup to get them into Mordor, to have all of these problems, these obstacles. And over the course of the story, the pacing is going to speed up, meaning the illusion of time passing and of the action in the scene is going to increase. Another thing that pacing does is it keeps the reader engaged. So for most books, you want to have a certain level of intensity as part of your pacing, and that intensity should fluctuate. So you might go from a level 10 intensity where there's lots of action, there's crazy stuff going on, characters running away from something, there's lots of stuff where it's just very intense, right? Usually you don't want to keep a book at that level of intensity the entire time that the reader is reading. You want to vary it up so the reader can feel like they can catch a breath. And so you might have a scene after that where it's just like more of a reactionary scene where the character can sort of pause to think about what just happened. That is another concept around pacing. But overall, if you looked at a general average of what pacing looks like, it will rise in intensity as you go along until the very climax of the story, at which point you get the falling action or the denouement where it comes back down. But in actuality, if you were to graph this, it would look more like a series of ups and downs that slowly go up until you reach the climax and then it falls down. That's how you vary the intensity of the scenes while also getting just higher and higher and higher. But if you're always at a 10, that's going to stress readers out. If you're always at a 2, the reader is going to get boring. So you want a little bit of that fluctuation. So how does the drop, this concept that I've identified, factor into this kind of pacing? Well, it's something that I've noticed that happens almost every single time right before the actual climax of the book. It's a powerful moment of pause that happens right before the maximum intensity of the entire book that we get at the very end of the climax. I call it the drop as a nod to the music industry. So if you're familiar with the drop in music, basically this is something you get especially in a lot of, let's say like digital techno kind of music, where it sort of builds an intensity over time. It gets, louder, 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 louder. It's crescendoing. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the drop comes where suddenly there's like a moment of silence, sometimes complete silence. And then boom, and it hits you with that enormous sort of satisfying climactic moment. And you see this in music all the time where it goes up, 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 and then pause. and then boom, right with that climactic piece of music. And so that's why I call this the drop. It is that moment right before the maximum climax when we sort of take a pause, we take a moment to reflect, and then in comes the big climactic moment, right? So I've seen different references to this moment when we're talking about the overall structure of the book, so much so that I actually created one of the chapters in my 40 chapter plot module. If you're unfamiliar with the 40 chapter plot module, you can download the cheat sheet for it for free. Just go down to the link that you'll find below, and you'll get access to it. So you can log into portal.storyhacker.ai. You'll be able to access it there. But one of the chapters out of that 40 chapter block, I call it the drop because it is this moment. Now, sometimes the drop can not be a whole chapter. Sometimes it can be just a moment right before the final climax, but I keep it as its own chapter just to emphasize the importance of having a very clear moment, very clear scene where this moment happens. I used to call this moment the use the force Luke moment because every film, Star Wars is a good example. So in Star Wars, at the very end, climactic moment, there's been this huge buildup, right? And not just in the actual events of the climax, but also in the music, right? John Williams is a genius, and the music really gets intense over the course of this climactic battle. And we finally get to this moment of almost peak climacticness, if that's a word, where Luke is going down the trench and he's got TIE fighters and Darth Vader on his back and things are not looking good. He's doing things exactly the same way that everybody else did and they all died, right? But then is a moment of peace. The music changes and it's something much more, it's the Force theme. So it's this da 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 da, and Luke is zeroing in and he hears Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice and he says, use the force, Luke. And he has this moment of pause. And it's a moment, and Blake Snyder and Save the Cat calls this the moment where you reach deep down. And the hero has to reach deep down inside themselves to retrieve something that they have learned over the course of the story. And it is that retrieval of that thing deep down that is going to help them, right? So it is a period of very intense introspection. And in the case of Star Wars, Luke, turns off his targeting computer. He goes full force mode where he's just allowing the force and Obi-Wan Kenobi to guide him. And that's the end of the drop, because right after that, he shoots the torpedoes, the Death Star blows up, and we have peak climax right there, right? So that's a good example of how the drop works as a whole for the entirety of your book. And that's built into my 40 chapter plot module. Again, go check that out. The link is below if you want to take a look at that. But did you know that this also works at the scene level? So every scene has actually a very similar structure to an overall story. It'll have things like an inciting incident, it'll have rising action, it'll have a climax. So at the end of every scene, or near the end of every scene, is this climactic moment. And I find that lots of authors, especially really successful authors, have moments in the end of these scenes where you have sort of a drop that happens and then something big occurs right after that, the climax of the scene, basically. So one good example of this is a moment that happens in the film version of The Two Towers, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. There's a moment in the battle at the end where a giant urukai comes with this torch and he's going towards this weakness in the wall, and they have gunpowder basically in this wall. He's going to take this torch and light the gunpowder to blow up the wall. And there's a lot of intensity leading up to this climactic moment for the scene, right? The climax of the scene is when the wall actually explodes, but there's a lot of buildup to this moment, right? So everything kind of goes quiet. And we see this guy, this enormous urukai with this torch. We know that he's going to go and try to blow this thing up. Aragorn starts yelling at Legolas to shoot the guy down, and Legolas shoots one arrow and it kind of misses. It hits the urukai in one shoulder, but it keeps going, right? And then Legolas tries again, shoots the urukai in the other shoulder. He keeps trying. Aragorn's yelling. Everything's just building in intensity and intensity. And then finally, there's the drop moment. And actually, if you go and look at some of the behind the scenes for this scene, you'll find out that in the sound editing for this scene, they pulled out everything for one shot. And that one shot was this urukai making the final leap into this like weak spot where the gunpowder is with his torch. You know, he's dying because he's got these arrows sticking out of him. He just makes a final sacrificial leap with the torch, and they pulled out all sound except for the sound of him actually, you know, like his grunting as he makes that leap. And so it's an actual like literal drop, very similar to how music works, where they pull out almost all of the sound after we've had this intensive buildup. And then finally, boom, the whole wall explodes, and it's the climactic end of that particular scene. So for that scene, we've had this buildup of intensity, then sort of pause, a drop, and then the big bang at the end of the climax. That's a good example of how this works in film. I want to also read to you a few paragraphs from a scene in Brandon Sanderson's Words of Radiance that really stuck out to me. Brandon Sanderson is really good at this drop thing, whether he knows it or not. A lot of his scenes have this very satisfying ending to them because he's using this sort of drop moment in the way that he is. So let me read to you a little bit from Words of Radiance, where he actually incorporates this drop. Wind blew in the opening in the wall, and Syl's ribbon of light became mist, a form she often took, silver mist, which grew larger, coalesced before Kaladin, extending into his hand. Glowing, brilliant, a shard blade emerging from the mist, vivid, blue light shining from swirling patterns along his length. Kaladin gasped a deep breath as if coming fully awake for the first time. The entire hallway went black, as the stormlight in every lamp down the length of the hall winked out. For a moment, they stood in darkness. Then Kaladin exploded with light. It erupted from his body, making him shine like a blazing white sun in the darkness. Moash backed away, face pale in the white brilliance, throwing up a hand to shade his eyes. So this is a brilliant moment in this particular scene, and it is kind of a climactic moment for the character as well, so there's that extra emphasis there. But you can see there was a buildup of just description of what was going on. Something big was happening. We have the glowing brilliant shard blade emerging from the mist, vivid blue light, all of this stuff, and then it has that drop moment, that moment of pause where it says, the entire hallway went black as the stormlight in every lamp down the length of the hall winked out, and for a moment they stood in darkness. And you'll see even for this particular paragraph, the line for a moment they stood in darkness, its own separate line. And you'll see this a lot when people are utilizing the drop, is they kind of take that quiet moment and make it one or two separate lines, because we're sort of adding emphasis to that particular moment and giving it a little bit of time to breathe. And then the very next line is, then Kaladin exploded with light, which is the pinnacle of the climax of this particular scene. And so that's an example of what it looks like in the actual text from a novel. And I find this to be a brilliant example of how the drop can work at a scene level as opposed to on a full novel level. Now, if you'd like to know a little bit more about story structure, I have a whole masterclass breaking down different forms of story structure where you'll learn how this drop sort of fits into the larger picture. So if you're interested in learning more about that, definitely check out that video, and I'll see you in the next one.